This week on Dialogue, winning or losing hearts and minds. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Milewski. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we explore the idea of winning hearts and minds in the Islamic world. Our guests are Roger Hardy, who is a Wilson Center public policy scholar and a former Middle East and Islamic affairs analyst for the BBC. Abdul Aziz Said is the senior ranking professor at American University and the first occupant of the endowed Mohammed Said Farsi Chair of Islamic Peace. Also with us, Roberto Toscano. Roberto is a Wilson Center public policy scholar who previously served as Italy's ambassador to Iran and more recently to India. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us. Also, even though you won't get to see them on the air, I want to tell you that Professor Said is not skipping class. He brought his class with him. In our audience are some members of the International Affairs School at American University. They're studying peace paradigms and their graduate students. We're happy to have you here, even though our viewers can't see you. On the radio portion, if you sneeze, our listeners can hear you. Gentlemen, I want to begin with some discussion of some definition. I think that once a phrase like winning hearts and minds has been around for a while, we almost use it automatically like an ad slogan or a campaign slogan, and I'm not sure that we're all talking about the same thing. We should take a moment to vet that. So, Roger, if I can begin with you, what's the definition of what we're talking about?
Well, we journalists love the term hearts and minds, and of course, the trouble with it is it's become a cliche, and like many cliches, it's become rather tired. I think we're talking about something very specific in US foreign policy since 9/11. The effort to try to combat Muslim extremism, particularly of the Al-Qaeda type, while somehow finding ways and means to strengthen the Muslim mainstream. Those are the two aspects of it, to my mind, and there's a certain tension between them. How can you do one and still achieve the other?
And who are the we who are attempting to win hearts and minds?
The United States and its allies in Europe, in the Arab world, in the wider Muslim world. Everybody, in a sense, is engaged in the same battle if they regard Al-Qaeda and that kind of Islamic extremism as a threat to them, and most of the regimes in that region do.
Professor Said, as we build the definition, what would you add to what Roger's had to say?
For me, it is opening hearts and minds.
Opening versus winning.
Hearts and minds.
What's the distinction?
The distinction, when we talk about opening, we are establishing a relationship. When we talk about winning, it's win, lose. We move away from that. It is opening minds and hearts. It is minding the heart. It's understanding the mind. It is dealing with the heart. It is freeing ourselves from the false trapping that we are involved. We are trapped in false images of one another. So for me, that's, yes, you mentioned 9/11, exactly. I mean, since 9/11, this has become a continuous theme. Persons like myself and many others have been invited many times by our officials to participate in that. The whole office of public diplomacy became much more important since then. So that's it.
Ambassador Toscano, first I should let you contribute to the definition before I ask you a different question.
Yeah, I think definitions are important. You know, Confucius once said, if you want peace in the kingdom, take good care of the definition. Let's take care of the definition. To me, well, I don't like hearts and minds as an expression. I prefer to talk about soft power. You know why? Because realists, who are the dominant tendency in international affairs and in diplomacy, try to dismiss the concept that you need something different from hard power. They are the ones, the tough guys, who think you need military and economic power and everything else will follow. It is not true. And besides, important countries and great countries have also great values. And if you are able to project your values, then you have contributed to your own power intended in a wider sense. I, for 30 years, was a so-called Sovietologist, East-West, and I served in Russia. And there is no doubt that the way that the Cold War was fought and won has a lot to do with soft power, culture, values. And so I think we should really reinterpret international relations, including soft power or hearts and mind, if you prefer.
During your time as an ambassador, your time as a diplomat, was there any sense that there was coordination or coherence among the Western allies in this outreach effort?
I'm afraid that sometimes we have behaved as if we thought that propaganda could do the job. People judge you from what you do, not what you say. For instance, the U.S. is not criticized, or it's sometimes, unfortunately, even hated in the Middle East because they hate freedom. They love freedom, as it is shown these days. But because they consider that the policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict is not balanced. And Europeans are criticized because of the way we treat Muslim immigrants, for instance, or the way we are, they say, disrespectful for Islam. So the problem is what we do, not what we say.
This Roberto introduced the term propaganda. Is that what we're talking about? Public diplomacy is maybe a more modern version of that terminology, but what essentially are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, after going back to September 9/11, those of us who were invited by the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy at that time, and a number of us were invited to be there, to participate with them.
Is that the Department of State, the U.S. Department of State?
What we learned from that meeting was more or less propaganda. We were given material to look at, to approve or disapprove. Said, hey, wait a little. We said, now, if you want us to be involved in this effort, we want to talk about American support for authoritarian governments. We want to talk about Israel, Palestine. They said, no, we can't talk about that. We said, if you can't talk about that, bye-bye.
So the assumption that propaganda is by its nature, based on what Professor Said just said, at least, if not untrue, only partially true.
I call this propaganda plus. I think propaganda is part of it. Information, as you said, public diplomacy, these are politer terms for really what some journalists call an info war, an information war. Why do I call it propaganda plus? Because it is about deeds as well as words. In fact, in many ways, it's very much about deeds as well as words. All kinds of deeds, not just military actions. The US military in places like Afghanistan is building roads, is building hospitals, is building bridges. I went down to Fort Bragg as part of my research, and I spent a day with soldiers and officers who'd spent a year in Afghanistan. And I asked one of them, did you make a difference to the village you're telling me about? And he told me about the difficulties, the Taliban, the fight, the fact that they don't stay there for a long time. There's a kind of rotation of people, all of which is a problem when you're trying to win the trust of the people. He said, they asked us to build a bridge, to link the people to a particular mosque, to make it easier for them to go to and fro. And his eyes were shining when he said this to me, and I was struck by this. He thought the most tangible, they'd done many things, but that the most tangible achievement that he and his troops had done in that village was to build that bridge.
The infrastructure.
That's not propaganda in the narrow sense of the word, because that could be described as altruism, and people could have said we should have been doing that kind of thing long before 9/11. We're not doing it only because of 9/11.
Roberto.
Yeah, since we are on definition, I would say that public diplomacy is just a component of soft power. The real core of soft power doesn't have to do with governments, but with societies. Societies project themselves internationally, globally. I'll give you one example. I arrived in the Soviet Union in 1975, Cold War, and the first two homes, Russian homes, I saw were first a student that we had met in a park and the babysitter of our child. In the first home, there was one picture on the wall, Ernest Hemingway. In the second, a journal cover cut and pasted on the wall, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Those two Russian citizens were not reached by American propaganda, but American society, its images,
Or
its
ideas.
and culture arrived.
Well, Ambassador, that my experience reflects your experience. In my travels in many parts of the world, what I have learned, what excites the imagination of non-Americans about America is not what we have done externally. Oh, when I'm lecturing in their universities or clubs, oh yes, they will engage me about American imperialism, etc., etc. But later when we are together, their curiosity about what we have done domestically, what really excites others is Martin Luther King, Women Liberation Movement, the whole development in the 60s, 70s, 80s, our history, what we have done domestically. And hence, when we talk about winning minds and hearts, hey, that already has won, has opened minds and hearts towards us. What closes it? And you went back to the question. It has to do with relationship. It has to do with listening, what you mentioned earlier. We listened in Afghanistan. They said, look here, we need roads, we need. So part of what we do in our program in peace studies in many places, we are developing courses entitled Localizing Peace. That peace has to be localized. Yes.
And Roger, you've written about the contradictions here. I mean, herein lies the problem. If America or the West is true to democratic ideals and ideas of freedom for all people, we're popular. Hearts and minds are won or opened. But there are contradictions in play.
One of the biggest accusations from people, one of the biggest suspicions always, that's always hanging in the air, that there's a double standard here. You want elections, but either for yourselves or people that you sympathize with in the region. Take the Palestinian case. If Hamas wins the Palestinian elections, oh, suddenly elections in that context are not such a good idea anymore. People are very quick to sense double standards. Double standards, there's a harsher word. I mean, they mean hypocrisy. That
Yes.
we preach something, but we don't practice it. At least we don't practice our principles in a uniform and consistent way. It's one of the strongest criticisms of US foreign policy and Western foreign policy more broadly. The criticism can apply to the British government, the French government, no less than the United States, but America is still the one remaining superpower, even if sometimes Americans forget about this now, given all the problems that you have. This is a US-led effort, without a doubt.
A superpower not feeling very super these days, I guess.
And you are right. The disconnect, the sense, the perception of disconnect between our values on the one hand and our practices, what we proclaim and what we are doing. And oftentimes public diplomacy has been used to kind of connect the two together, but in a superficial way. One of the great things we have done recently is let Egyptians do what they are doing. Yeah. And we are discovering that, yes, and let Tunisians do what they are doing. We are discovering, yes. Yes, that's...
It's probably worth spending some time on this notion of a counter-narrative. If we're attempting to win hearts and minds or open hearts and minds, who's the competition? What's the narrative? Is it the Al-Qaeda narrative, as you've referred to it? What is the competing idea?
I think there's a very powerful idea out there which is exploited powerfully by groups of the Al-Qaeda type, that the West is at war with Islam. Now, US presidents, including George Bush and now Barack Obama, when he went to Cairo and made the Cairo speech, he said, America is not and will never be at war with Islam. He says it, and I'm sure he believes it, and I think George Bush believed it too. I don't doubt their sincerity. The question is their credibility, not their sincerity. Because people, let's say you're in an area of Pakistan where predator drones come, these unmanned aircraft that strike against militant suspects, suspected Al-Qaeda people. People won't say, won't be wowed by the notion of American soft power, the persuasibility of the American
Well, that's
narrative.
hard power right there.
And they will, the local narrative will be, oh, they attacked a wedding party by mistake, or, oh yeah, they killed Mohammed, and then people don't say anything about Mohammed. Maybe he was a member of some group, but members of Mohammed's family were there, and what were they guilty of? It's not just squaring your principles with your actions, it's when your actions will inevitably be seen in an aggressive light, in a hostile light, by people at the receiving end.
And when the strategic doctrine is presented as a war on terrorism. And that's part of the issue.
Is there a coherent narrative from the West in this regard? I mean, we heard the Cairo speech, and he received high marks. The president received high marks from that from many quarters. But a lot of people were just relieved that it wasn't George W. Bush. It was a different narrative, at least in tone. But is there something coherent? For example, the president's response to Egypt. Some have been critical that one day it seemed as if he was saying, let Mubarak stay in an orderly manner. The next day it was get out, trying to have it both ways. What is the narrative?
John, forgive me, but I have to respond to that.
Sure.
Yes, there is. We prevent the building of mosques. Whether us and
talking about the ground zero, so-called ground zero incident.
We forbid the building of minarets. Oh yes, they see it. We may not see that.
The minister who was going to burn Qurans. How hurtful is that? How much does that set
Very
back
much
the cause?
so, because here I would like to add one specific, because I talked about East-West, the Russians, but the culture of Islam and the culture of that region is very sensitive to matters of respect, dignity, humiliation.
Honor is a word.
Honor. It's not something culturalist. It's something that's brought by history. It's brought by the fact that colonialists did not respect, and local non-democratic leaders never respected the people. So respect is a very fundamental dimension. I will make one example. You remember, of course, the famous Axis of Evil speech. Now, if anybody were to say that Italians belong to the axis of evil, we would just laugh. For the Iranians, it was an offense beyond politics, beyond the regime. They felt it as a slight. They felt as non-recognition of their history, of their dignity. So I think this respect dimension should be well taken care of.
That's true. However, the United States, this may apply to Europe, but the United States has never colonized Muslims or Arabs. See, that's the other part. The United States, this applies to the colonial powers, the British, the French, the Russians, and others. But that's part of the question. The United States hasn't colonized them.
You know, we use often fancy language. We use words like narrative to mean a certain kind of message. And of course, in a very diverse society like the United States, messages are coming from all over the place. But let's focus for a moment on the government. Now, I sometimes think at this level, we're talking about the propaganda war. Let's call it that.
The U.S. government? Is that
the U.S. government versus Al-Qaeda. It's kind of like an elephant fighting a snake. The United States government, meaning State Department, Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, all the other bits and pieces, USAID, who are building some of these bridges and roads in these places, very important part of the effort. But taken as a whole, it's like a behemoth. It is a great bureaucratic monster, compared with which Al-Qaeda, and I'm not pretending for a moment that Al-Qaeda are Superman and without flaws. You know, they have many flaws, many weaknesses. But in terms of their propaganda abilities, using the internet, which they have mastered with tremendous skill.
Are you describing it's streamlined, less editors?
It's streamlined, but my point is the snake is always more nimble. And it's easier for the snake to have, as it were, a single message than the behemoth, which is made of a dozen big entities and a lot of smaller entities. One congressional report told me that more than 60 government agencies and other bodies, official bodies, are involved in one way or another in the Hearts and Minds effort. Think about that.
But messages are important. You mentioned Al-Qaeda. Their message, as ugly as it is, as violent as it is coherent, our message is incoherent. So part of the strength of messages is the coherence of the
It's
message.
coherent and it resonates among Muslims who have no murderous or suicidal intention whatsoever. They do not share the method, as it were. They're not that angry that they want to kill someone or kill themselves. But the sense of grievance, I call it a kind of well of grievance. And people can draw from the same well. And what are the grievances? They're both internal and external. The regimes are mostly autocratic. They abuse human rights. There's pervasive corruption. All the grievances we're seeing being attacked on a daily basis in Egypt and Tunisia and now many other places as well. And then there's the external enemy, the sense that the West has power, which the world of Islam historically used to have but doesn't have now. There's this sense, the world of Islam used to be so powerful. Why have we sunk so low? And the force that's deemed to have pushed them so low is the West, principally the United States.
You know, the point has been made here that, well, we're a little incoherent, perhaps in our message, not doing as well as we can in some areas. Contradictions exist. What I'm wondering, is there a country among the Western allies that's doing a better job than others?
Norway.
And Sweden. And Denmark.
No, it's not a joke.
Well, no, but I know. And so, what can we learn from them? It's not. So, what is it? What are they getting right that much of us are getting wrong?
First of all, they are taking their principles seriously. They have no ambitions, because it's true that the U.S. was not colonial power, but there is a difference between colonialism and imperialism. You can be an imperialist without even going there, just by exerting influence and pressure. I think that, you know, once I worked for DAC OECD in Paris. I was chairing a working group on conflict prevention. And it became very clear through a couple of years of meetings that conflicts are produced by grievance, not by poverty or by absolute entities, but by perceived offense, by perceived injustice. So we should address grievance in whatever we say. We should address it materially. Because otherwise we just try to, for instance, talk ideology. And although there are minorities that are moved by ideology, the fanatics, and so, normal people usually are moved by substantial
the results
things.
Yeah.
And grievance, incidentally, grievance is produced by human rights violations. So let's focus on what is important.
Gentlemen, we're down to only about 3 minutes remaining for our conversation, and lots still to talk about. But before we close out, I'd like to give each of you a moment to talk about looking forward. What are the things that we should be doing, perhaps with what happened in Egypt and the opportunity that creates? And we'll begin in the order of introduction. Roger, you have about a minute.
Well, since I've said something about Al-Qaeda and what I call the extended family of Al-Qaeda, the groups that are like-minded, I think what's significant at the moment, may be very significant, it's a bit early to tell, is how wrong-footed they've been by these popular revolts in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. They're left in the place where they really don't want to be, as essentially passive onlookers. They were the guys who were supposed to be the voice of grievance in these countries, and they're not. And the method that they propose, armed revolutionary struggle to get rid of the regimes, is not the method that's been used by the people in Tunisia and Egypt. From Western point of view, if this is right, and this continues to be so, we're very lucky, because it means that those guys have discredited themselves rather more than we have managed to discredit them.
Professor Said.
Empowerment. The political conduct of many Muslims is a conduct that is deeply rooted in a deep sense of powerlessness, in a deep sense of disempowerment. So it is empowerment, to support them in their own empowerment. When Muslims were strong, they were open for ideas. They were open for scholarship, for sciences. But certainly this whole notion of disempowerment, of a sense of powerlessness, Islamicists are a modernized people. These people, they are modernized, using the language of Islam. But we are pretty modernized.
Ambassador Toscano, you
Two
get the
priorities.
final word.
First, address social problems, especially those related to young people, employment and empowerment and so on. Second, understand that religion has a role to play even when it's not fundamentalist, especially if it's not fundamentalist. And understand that secularism can be of two kinds. The American kind, which is quite compatible with Islam, or the French kind, which is hostile to religion. This second secularism will not work.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a terrific conversation. Appreciate it. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.